morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. A historic shakeup in U.S. politics. Joe Biden quits the presidential race after weeks of relentless pressure and endorses Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic candidate. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netayahu heads to the U.S. to address Congress. That's after the IDF struck a port in Yemen in retaliation for a drone strike in Tel Aviv. Plus, IPOs in the Middle East are showing no signs of stopping. We look at investor appetite in our weekly Mideast Money segment. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates, everybody. Good morning. Happy Monday. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. Lots to get caught up on. We are going to spend a good chunk of this program talking about all of the developments out of U.S. politics. But first, let us, as ever, take a look at how markets are responding to this bombshell news that U.S. President is standing down from re-election. He will not be running as next presidential candidate, which, of course, opens the floor up to the Vice President Kamala Harris, but still not yet set in stone. So how have markets reacted? As you can see, U.S. futures are leaning towards the green, up around 0.2%. This despite its worst week since April last week. For the week, the S&P was down about 1.3%. A lot of shakeout in tech stocks. Magnificent Seven down about 5%. You want to watch out for earnings this week with Tesla and Alphabet kicking things off, and then next week some of the other names to watch. So that's from an earnings perspective. But as far as politics could go, look at 10-year yields. What we are seeing today is yields have rallied about 2 basis points. The beginning of some of an unwind of those Trump trades that were put on in the last couple of weeks. And remember, protectionism, inflationary, higher yields, stronger dollar. What we're seeing today is lower yields and a slightly weaker dollar. So reverse as some of those trades come through. And then Asian Pacific equities, you can see down 1% overnight. And this tells you again that there is still a lot of consternation in the air about what's going to happen with U.S. politics and what it means for those geopolitical relationships. One thing I do want to show you, and this has come through just in the last couple of hours or so, really interesting, because what we have seen is a spike in funding come through. So ActBlue is a metric that tracks how many donations are coming in to the Democratic Party. Over 60 million have come through just in the last couple of hours. And you can see that big bump happened after Biden announced that he was dropping out of the race. Through the course of the evening, more than $60 million has come through to the Democratic Party. So big numbers we're talking about there. And it tells you that a lot of money actually was sitting on the sidelines waiting for further visibility about the path ahead. So let's talk more about that top story. U.S. President Joe Biden has abandoned his re-election bid and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to take his place as the Democratic nominee. Now, Harris says she is honored to have the president's support and intends to earn and win the party's nomination. Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn joins us now from Washington, D.C. Vonnie, just give us a sense for how the reaction has been from the Democratic Party. And 10 hours is a very long time since the moment that Biden announced that he's no longer running to actually throwing his weight behind Kamala Harris.
Exactly, Jumana. So it just happened at around about 2 p.m. local time. We're now at midnight local time. So as you say, just more than 10 hours since that post went out on X. A statement that, by the way, even more or less took his staff by surprise. They had only found out a few minutes earlier. He's been in confinement at home with COVID-19. This would have been the 4th day of that. And so this statement was not something that the staff knew was coming. That said, throughout the afternoon, we started to get a flood of endorsements, a trickle at first, and then more and more people coming out, more powerful people, and then delegations coming out saying that they were throwing their support behind Kamala Harris. I'm talking delegates from New York, New Hampshire, South Carolina. That puts paid to the idea that perhaps the Republicans can contest this legally somehow, that there might be some way of having an open convention, a brokered convention forced upon the Democrats. It doesn't seem like the Democrats want this, because throughout the afternoon, as you mentioned, several high-profile Democrats came out, from the Clintons to Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, Elizabeth Warren, the Congressional Black Caucus, so many more, giving their full-throated endorsement to Kamala Harris, wanting to show a united party. This, of course, following the RNC, which had very much united the Republicans.
Notably, though, I thought it was interesting that Obama hasn't. So there, you know, I don't know how much we want to read into that. Assuming that Harris does end up becoming the eventual presidential candidate, Do we have any ideas as of now who could potentially complete the ticket with her, who her choice for vice president might be?
Definitely a few. And just to your point about the former President Obama, exactly, some faint praise. That was about the extent of the challenge to the Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket idea. So President Obama talked about how wonderful a job Joe Biden had done, didn't endorse Kamala Harris. Neither did Nancy Pelosi, but we know she's also been looking for an open convention. But they were the highlights of those who didn't. We didn't actually have anybody coming out and challenging her openly or saying that they wanted to throw their hat in the ring. Joe Manchin may do so tomorrow, according to an aide, but even he may not be taken that seriously. But you did mention potential VP picks. She does have 4 weeks plus to decide, but there are some that are considering it. Clearly, Governor Josh Shapiro would be a potential pick. He would bring her a blue state like Pennsylvania, Andy Beshear of Kentucky, J.D. Pritzker of Illinois. We know that two that we might have considered potential picks, Gavin Newsom of California and Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, are not considering challenging Kamala Harris or looking to be potentially her vice presidential pick. I mean, for one, Gavin Newsom is from her state, so it wouldn't potentially help the ticket. Gretchen Whitmer is a woman, and she has also told an aide that it's a difficult time and a strange time in politics, and she wouldn't want to be considered as a vice presidential pick. Pete Buttigieg, though, however, is another name. And several of those that I mentioned are appearing on morning shows in the US on Monday morning, so we should hear from them. Kamala Harris, of course, speaks at 11:30 a.m. US time.
Yeah, and we'll be watching out for what she has to say. Her first remarks since all of this happened yesterday. Vonnie Quinn in D.C., great to see you. Thank you. Let's bring in Laura Blessing, Senior Fellow at the Government Affairs Institute, Georgetown University. Good evening to you, Laura. Let me just start off by asking you what you make of President Biden's decision to not seek re-election.
Well, it's a momentous but not an unexpected change. After the widely panned debate performance that he had against candidate Trump, there has been an increasing flood of calls for him to step down, both for the sake of the campaign, but also for the sake of what governance might look like.
And as my colleague Vonnie was just highlighting, just in the last few hours, Kamala Harris has seen the support come through from some heavyweights within the Democratic Party. You've got the likes of Gavin Newsom, Elizabeth Warren, the Black Caucus, the Clintons have also thrown their weight. But then, most notably, former President Obama put out a note where he was praising his friend and former Vice President and current President Biden for his many achievements, but also then said that he trusts that the democratic process will take place in order to select the next candidate. Should the convention be an open convention, to your mind?
I think that's highly unlikely. I also want to take the opportunity to address something that Speaker Johnson has said and that your previous guest mentioned, this idea that replacing Biden is problematic or even illegal is not actually accurate. Of course, he was the presumptive nominee. He was not the official nominee. The Democratic Party doesn't have an official nominee until after the convention. That being said, the number of different political actors, both members of Congress, governors, the Clintons, other folks that are coalescing against the Harris candidacy very, very quickly is very notable, even and including many of the likely vice presidential picks. I would put more stock into how fast people are getting behind her, including potential vice presidential picks, than the fact that, Obama may be waiting, some unspecified amount of time to make a specific statement on this.
It feels like the intensity of our discussions obviously grew a lot post that presidential debate and President Biden's very poor performance. But even before that, Laura, Biden was struggling to keep up momentum. His favorability ratings had started dropping even before that presidential debate. The achievements on the economy were just not resonating with the public. A lot of backlash over his unflinching support of Israel over the Gaza war that may cost him some votes as well. How is that all likely to change with a Harris on the ticket, if at all?
That's a really good question. I think that any other Democratic nominee, and I think, Harris will be our likely person here, would not have the problems with Gaza that we've seen with the Biden campaign. So Michigan, an important battleground state, as you know, I think is far more likely to be a possibility for a Harris candidacy. But we also have a number of different demographics that, you can look at polling and public opinion to note that, for example, younger voters were particularly opposed to Biden's age, but also answering polls saying that they were less likely to vote. I think there's a good chance that that might change with a Harris candidacy. We can also look at votes like, people of color and women candidates. Abortion as an issue is incredibly important, both in terms of policy that affects people's lives, but also in its relevance to the campaign. And Harris has been a very outspoken fighter on this issue. So I think she's better positioned.
Well, I actually was going to bring that up with you, and to what extent you think her stance on abortion and the fact that she's been a very effective campaigner pro-abortion is going to actually resonate with the U.S. public when you have juxtaposed against her, the likes of J.D. Vance, who has taken a very extreme view from the other side of the aisle.
I think you're asking that question exactly the right way. I think it's quite the juxtaposition, and she's been out front on this issue very, very clearly since the Supreme Court struck down the protections that were afforded by Roe v. Wade since 1973. We've also seen, we can slice and dice different demographics. I saw something recently that, women in swing states had abortion as their number one issue. So this may be consequential for that slice of the voting public as well.
And finally, let me just leave you with a question about how you think former President Trump is viewing all of this. I know he called in or had a conversation with CNN shortly after the news came out yesterday, suggesting that even if Harris were to become the presidential candidate, she still wouldn't have a chance against him. Typical Trump language there. But how do you think he and the Republican Party are looking to capitalize on some of the turmoil within the Democratic Party over the last couple of weeks?
Sure. Well, Donald Trump as a candidate is never short on confidence in his spoken remarks, but I think it's a very different campaign now that Harris is likely to be the candidate. We will see that play out in the coming days. We've already seen candidate Trump say that he will only do a debate if it's on Fox News, which seems to be a defensive positioning there. But we will see how they react to this. Their pick of J.D. Vance was a very confident pick. This was a very confident campaign. And I think we may see some tempering of some of that strategy going forward.
Well, it's interesting because even financial markets are beginning to temper their expectations of a red wave or a done deal as far as a Trump win is concerned. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. A real pleasure to talk to you. Laura Blessing, Senior Fellow at the Government Affairs Institute, Georgetown University. Well, that is not the only news that we've been following overnight for financial markets. So we also had a surprise interest rate cut out of the PBOC. Let's check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio as ever. Avril, just give us an overview of how markets have interpreted that rate cut.
Yeah, the PBOC cut to that key short-term rate was unexpected. This is the first time we're seeing this in about a year, but what it signals is how the central bank might be more supportive of the economic recovery going forward, and also a shift towards using that rate, the 7-day reverse repo, as the benchmark. Now, we're actually seeing a reaction in Chinese bonds. They're continuing their climb. We're keeping a close eye on the 10-year. It's already sitting below the 2.25% level, which is seen as a red line for the PBOC. But as you can see here, it's also very risk-off in the markets as chip stocks are bearing the brunt of the selling for yet another week. And this is amid those continued concerns about where U.S. policies go from here. Don't forget, we also have the Mag 7s that are reporting this week. That will be a key test for the AI rally. And then also Morgan Stanley lowering its view on Asia IT, including taking TSMC off a focus list. So these are among the things that we're watching in the region today, Jumana.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview. Avril Hong in Singapore. And up next on our show, Benjamin Netayahu will address the U.S. Congress on Wednesday as Israel faces major challenges at home and abroad. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to Washington today. The shifting of political winds in the U.S. could see a confident Netanyahu taking his message to a weakened Biden as Israeli forces continue attacking Gaza. The two leaders will meet tomorrow, and in a rare honor for the Israeli Prime Minister, he will address Congress on Wednesday, even though I believe this is the fourth time he actually addresses U.S. Congress, a record for a world leader. Bloomberg's executive editor for the Middle East, North Africa and Russia, Stuart Wallace, joins me right now. So we talk about a potentially emboldened Netanyahu heading towards D.C. Is that the right phrase or the right adjective to be using, given his own popularity is at the lows?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's been invited by both Democrats and Republicans. As you said, I think he's either he matches or exceeds Winston Churchill in terms of invitations to address Congress, which is quite something. He's the longest-serving Israeli leader, and at least on the face of it, he appears to be winning in Gaza. Now, winning in inverted commas, clearly, because there's no great winners out of that one.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of history there, because the last time he addressed Congress was back in 2015 at the request of the Republicans, and he used that as a platform to chastise the Obama administration for the Iranian deal. What are we likely to hear out of his address to Congress this time around?
I think he will largely focus, or at least one of his focuses will be trying to remind the US of what's at stake in the Middle East. So he's going to paint this picture of Iran that's funding at least 5 proxy forces around the region, causing chaos with shipping, disrupting global trade, causing death on a vast scale by arming all these groups and funding them and providing intelligence. So again, I think it's going to be a reminder to the US that while in the longer term the US probably does want to withdraw from the region to some extent, at least for now, it will have to double down in terms of its commitments.
What is all this, tumultuous backdrop in U.S. politics mean for the ceasefire talks? Because it feels as though there actually has been some progress recently in Cairo. Both sides seem they're moving closer and closer towards actually getting the ceasefire deal across the line. Does it matter that the U.S. president is stepping down from re-election and that there are all these questions about who's going to replace him? Or is it business as usual from the State Department's perspective?
Yeah, I would say it certainly doesn't help, that's for sure. But Biden himself was not doing most of the negotiations. And one of the things you can say about him is that he appointed a series of highly competent officials to do it on his behalf. And yes, you're right. I think they have been making some progress. I think there are a lot of sticking points. And to some extent, Netanyahu is one of those big sticking points because he's forever changing the narrative about what he wants or what he's prepared to accept.
A quick one, Stuart. How should we read the tit-for-tat between Israel and Houthis that has really intensified over the weekend?
That it will continue. I think that ultimately is the lesson to be taken away from this, is that, yes, you can bomb a port city, but it's in no way going to deter the Houthis. And you can just see that from the fact that the Houthis have already been bombed on multiple occasions by allied forces. They continue to attack shipping. The narrative hasn't changed.
Yeah, and we spoke about that. June saw the biggest uptick in attacks on vessels for the whole year. So they're not going away quietly, these Houthis. Stuart, thanks very much. Stuart Livingstone Wallace, our executive editor for MENA and Russia. Coming up later here on the show, investor appetite is growing for IPOs across the Middle East. We'll have more on what this means for the region going forward with the Middle East CEO of Nomura Asset Management. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following this morning. The global IT failure triggered by a botched update of CrowdStrike software on Friday affected more than 5.8 million Microsoft devices worldwide. The company says those affected represented fewer than 1% of all devices that use Windows. The issue hit healthcare systems, companies, and airlines around the world. And bankers from Hong Kong and Dubai to South Africa and London were also caught up in the global IT outage, leaving some unable to log on to their computer systems. Some staff at banks, including JP Morgan and Bank of America, were met with a blue error screen. The Central Bank of Norway said it would have to conduct a banking system liquidity auction via email and over the phone on Friday due to problems with its own online system. So let's just take a quick look at how some of the key sectors that were affected reacted, namely the airline space, because so many of these flights had to be grounded, rerouted, and as you can see, here we're listing up all of the various airlines that actually got affected within the U.S. United, Delta, American Spirit. Delta, the hardest hit, with them reporting that up to 1,300 U.S. flights were grounded, but Delta Airlines had to cancel about 1/3 of their flights on Friday alone. So let's just look at the market price reaction by the end of the day in some of these key airlines. So starting with the U.S. first, even though I was just talking about Delta and the fact that they did cancel about 1/3 of their flights, you can see that by the end of the day, actually, Delta did end the session in positive territory. United Airlines up 3.3%, namely because of how they handled it with customers. They gave customers waivers and so forth. So despite all of the headlines and some of the chaos that was reported at many of these airports around the U.S., the actual airline stocks ended the day up in the green. You cannot say the same for European airlines, however. This was the picture across the Atlantic, and you can see European airlines did not fare well at all. So by the end of the day, British Airways owner IAG ended the session down 2.2%, Ryanair down 1.5%, Lufthansa. So all of these stocks were trading around 2% lower on the day. This as carriers canceled thousands of flights and still, even to this moment, have many of the planes and crews in the wrong place, even though many of the airports are reporting that business is back to usual again. So a very big moment on Friday had significant implications across all sectors, airlines the most heavily hit, as you can see. All right, we're going to move on and talk about our main story of the day, which, of course, is rolling around U.S. politics, as U.S. President Joe Biden has now exited the presidential race and has endorsed his vice president. Many are questioning whether Kamala Harris has enough support to win the new Democratic Party ticket. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning again. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. A historic shakeup in U.S. politics. Joe Biden quits the presidential race after weeks of relentless pressure and endorses Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic candidate. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netayahu heads to the U.S. to address Congress. That's after the IDF struck a port in Yemen in retaliation for a drone strike in Tel Aviv. Plus, IPOs in the Middle East are showing no signs of stopping. We look at investor appetite in our weekly Mideast Money segment coming up in a few moments. Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Let's get you caught up on these markets. We had a terrible week for the S&P last week. It's seen its worst week since April, down more than 1.7%. And despite that, what we are seeing is a bit of green on the board this morning. The futures are inching towards a positive open, up about 0.2%. Mega week coming up for earnings. Magnificent Seven, again, we saw a big pullback last week. Those stocks down 5%. You want to watch out for Tesla and Alphabet earnings this week. But of course, politics is front and center. And what we're seeing is a lot of the Trump trades that people had started to put on the last couple of weeks that involved a positioning for higher yields and a stronger dollar are now being unwound. So the 10-year note is about 2 basis points lower, the dollar a little bit weaker. And then what we're seeing in Asia Pacific, some of these equities are still continuing on with that negative momentum we've seen as of late, with Asia Pacific markets down about 1%. But I also want to draw your attention to an interesting terminal chart that we've been monitoring this morning, That is, ever since President Biden announced that he is no longer running as the next presidential candidate, we've seen a massive uptick of donations come in to the Democratic Party. So actually $65 million, even more than $50 million now, $65 million has come through since Biden made that announcement yesterday afternoon. So it does tell you that, again, a lot of money was sitting on the sidelines waiting for some certainty or a little bit more clarity as to the fate of Biden and whether or not he was going to run again. Now that we have that certainty, the donor money has started to come back to the party. But let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring in April. It's not just reaction to the U.S. political news that investors are digesting, but also that surprise interest rate cut out of China today.
Yeah, I think those are the two key themes that we're watching in this part of the world. And it's interesting to see how the Hang Seng seems to be getting a bit of a reprieve from Biden dropping out of the race. But in the Asia, chip stocks still deeply negative. The selling extending for another week. The likes of TSMC taking a beating. It's not just about the uncertainty surrounding U.S. policies. We also have those Mag 7 earnings coming up this week, some of them reporting. That's going to be a key test for the AI rally. And then we have the likes of Morgan Stanley also lowering their view on Asian IT. They've removed the likes of TSMC and SK Hynix from their focus list. So among the headwinds for some of these Asia tech names, but let's flip the board and take a look at the impact that we're seeing on Chinese bonds from that surprise rate cut from the PBOC today. Of course, the Chinese banks also followed suit by trimming the 1-year and 5-year loan prime rate. The message seems to be one that is supportive potentially of the economy going forward in China. And we're also keeping a really close watch on where we see the yield on the 10-year. It already dipped below the 2.25% level. That's seen as a line in the sand of sorts for the PBOC. Jumana.
Yeah. To your point, I was just looking at TSMC stock down 10% just in the last week, April. Thank you for that overview. Well, reaction to Joe Biden's decision to exit the U.S. presidential race and his endorsement of a replacement is continuing to pour in. Within hours of Biden's decision, many of the biggest names in Democratic politics rushed to join him in backing Vice President Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. But some prominent Democratic donors are questioning the hurry, signaling a divide between Democrats and the people who fund their campaigns. So let's go back to Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn, who joins us now from Washington, D.C. One thing that I was looking at, Vonnie, is a recent poll put Kamala Harris's favorability ratings quite low. Only 29% of the public surveyed viewed her favorably, 49% unfavorably. How does this translate into her odds against, potential odds against running against Trump later in the year?
Well, Jumana, I think we have to wait for about 2 weeks before we'll really have any polls that reflect the current reality, which is now Kamala Harris is very, very likely the Democratic nominee. Not fully, because there still is the convention to get to, and there might be attempts for there to be an open convention or a brokered convention. But it hasn't even been 12 hours since Joe Biden dropped that statement on X that he was pulling out. And we have seen a flood, a trickle become an absolute flood of support for Kamala Harris. You mentioned that there was a little bit of faint praise from some. You're talking there about former President Biden, Nancy Pelosi and so on. But the vast majority of the Democratic Party and those who speak for the Democratic Party are saying this is our nominee. We fully support her with the full-throated endorsement of everybody around us, including the state delegations, interestingly, because that would be one area where the Republicans could have tried to legally fight this. But state delegations are also coming out one by one and saying that they support this. Obviously, Kamala Harris will have to make a vice presidential pick, and there are several names that are on the list there. Pete Buttigieg, for example. Also, there's several governors. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania would be a very important one. Pennsylvania had been a blue state for the longest time. It turned red, of course, in the last election, and it's one of the potential paths to the White House for the Democrats. So he could be a potential pick. And there are several others, although the California governor, Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer, as we know now, are not looking to challenge Kamala. Neither is anybody else except potentially Joe Manchin, although how seriously that will be taken, we'll have to wait and see. He's giving an interview to Fox News on Monday afternoon. And just one final thing, you mentioned donations. Those Act Blue platform donations are small dollar donations. It's the best day since the very beginning of this race, which goes to show you how amped up the electorate became when this confusion went away. We also have some major donors that are very likely to come back into the fold now for Kamala.
Yeah, and it seems as though really people were just sitting on the sidelines waiting for that clarity. Vonnie, thank you so much for the reporting from DC. Vonnie Quinn. All right, let's turn to IPOs in the Middle East now. Local investor appetite has soared as oil revenue flows into the region, while the Gulf's push to reduce reliance on the energy sector has meant governments are encouraging firms to go public to bolster their capital markets. Let's bring in Tarek Fadlallah, Nomura Asset Management Middle East CEO. It certainly still appears to be the case that the outlook for ECM, for deal-making, for IPOs is still very healthy within the region. How do you see it?
Good morning. As you say, the appetite continues to be very strong. Not only do we have a deal pipeline of IPOs, but the oversubscription rates that we're seeing for the IPOs is extremely high. And so that speaks to the fact that we should continue to see good demand and therefore a reasonable amount of supply.
How much of this demand do you think is coming from abroad? Much was made out of the fact that Aramco's secondary offering, you had about 60% foreigner demand, but it seems to me that that is a specific situation, a bit of an outlier compared to other deals in the region.
Yes, correct. So Aramco, well-known international name, they did a lot of marketing for that, even years in advance. And so that's a very specific case, as you say. But generally speaking, the appetite for these tend to be local and it tends to be large.
And what do you think needs to be done in order to bring in more international investors to these other names in the region?
So I think it's an issue that we've grappled with in the region for a number of years. One of the things that you find, for example, in Saudi Arabia, is that the share of active managers investing in Saudi Arabia amongst the EM managers is still relatively small. And so we need to address whatever it is that's preventing these investors from buying into the stocks.
Yeah. Let me just ask you a macro question. The big story last week, away from U.S. politics, because really that's been dominating everything, was the IMF's downgrade of Saudi Arabian economy. A lot was made out of it from within Saudi, outside. We actually spoke to the IMF ourselves, and they called it a recalibration of the Saudi economy. But the reason that they downgraded growth was namely on back of lower oil production. How do you view the Saudi economy here? Are you worried about the path forward from a growth perspective?
No, not at all. So, as you say, the IMF downgraded it specifically because of the cut in oil production. So the non-oil economy continues to perform very well. And Saudi is a huge transformation story. And within that transformation, you're going to get some cyclicality. So, downgrade to 1.7%, the economy is still growing, a government spending a lot of money compared to 10 years ago. There's been a 50% increase in government spending. So that's a huge amount that goes into the economy.
But when you read these stories, for example, put out by my Bloomberg colleagues saying that they have had to downsize or reshift their focus towards other projects, right-size some projects, some of these mega projects, which, were estimated to cost more than $1 trillion. Is it your expectation that the more Saudi Arabia does this, the more harmful it's going to be on economic growth prospects going forward?
No, I don't think so. I think one issue is that you use the word right size, and I think that's very important because sometimes if you have too much money and you spend it too quickly, you're not spending it in the most efficient way. And so if you have time to reflect or if you're under constraints to make sure that you get value for your investments, I think that's probably not a bad discipline to have.
Yeah, so you don't see it as sort of a recognition that there may be funding issues in Saudi Arabia to finance?
Well, I mean, there may be. I mean, every country has constraints on funding. So, the big question in economics is how do we invest our scarce resources in the most efficient way? And so this is one issue that you have. So Saudi Arabia is a very rich country, but like every other country, it has to balance its fiscal responsibility with what it has to achieve.
Yeah. Let me bring in back the U.S. politics. I'm very curious to hear, from somebody who's based and sitting in the Middle East, focused on this region, how you think U.S. politics could impact the next 4 years. If we do see a return of President Trump, how is that likely to affect the Middle East markets?
Well, generally speaking, over the last 25 years that I've been in this region, I've seen Republicans and Democrats in the White House, and generally, I would say that there's not really a lot of difference in terms of foreign policy attitude towards the region. However, do bear in mind that President Trump has been in office before, and his very first trip as President of the United States was to the region. So I don't think that we should approach the next 4 years with any trepidation if he does get re-elected.
How can we forget the sword dancing, of course? Maybe we'll get a repeat of that.
And the orb, yes.
Exactly. Well, final question then, just to wrap it up. Trump spoke about drill, baby, drill. What does that mean for the region? If U.S. Start opening up the floodgates of supply, I mean, obviously their production has been increasing instrumentally the last couple of years, but if there's more drilling out of the U.S., that's going to put even more downside pressure on OPEC and, of course, the region.
Yes, possibly. I mean, I wouldn't overstate that. And the reason is that there are other constraints, financing constraints from banks and from investors that are more reluctant to fund oil going forward, given ESG constraints, but also, the outlook for demand. I mean, who wants to be exploring for oil today if the forecast over the next 20, 30 years is potentially for less oil demand?
Yeah. Tarek, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today on the show. A pleasure to chat to you. Tarek Fadlallah, Nomura Asset Management Middle East CEO. Thank you very much. Well, for more of these stories looking into the intersection of wealth and power in the region, sign up for our Mideast Money newsletter on Bloomberg.com. And coming up, some of the biggest companies across Africa are set to report their results this week. We'll drill down into what we can expect from platinum producer Amplats next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. It is a busy week ahead for Africa. Some of the continent's biggest companies are set to report their results. Amongst those expected to report early in the week are platinum metals producer Amplats and Africa's top iron ore miner Kumba. Dangote Cement and Kenyan-based East African breweries are also reporting later in the week as well. So busy earnings week. For more on this, Bloomberg's Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabazaja joins us from Johannesburg. Jen, what are you watching out for?
Yeah, Jumana, I mean, we are getting a lot of second quarter results on the western side, but here in the region, as you mentioned, we are paying close attention to a lot of these major companies for their half-year results. So you mentioned there today, really the big question, the big thing that we're going to be paying attention to is Anglo American's platinum unit, which is called Amplats. It has been in the news for quite a while this year, of course, because the company is gearing up to be spun off of its parent company, Anglo American. So the big question will be whether or not their earnings will continue to hold up. We got their second quarter production estimates, which beat city estimates. We'll see whether or not, though, earnings will be able to hold that up, especially because we've seen PGM prices decline. Then we'll get Kumba on Tuesday. That's Africa's top iron ore producer. We'll again see whether or not this weaker demand from China and Europe is having an effect on the company. And then finally, in East Africa, we will get Diageo's Kenya unit, East African breweries. And the key thing here is, of course, we've been paying close attention to what has been happening in Kenya, what President Ruto has attempted to do in order to bring down the deficit in the country. We'll see whether or not that has had an effect on the company, and also whether or not some of his proposals and also the unrest that we've seen in the country, whether or not that is going to impact their forward guidance. So yes, a busy week for us here in the region.
Yeah, certainly really interesting, especially Anglo American, their subsidiary kicking things off. So that's on the earnings front. Monetary policy, what are we expecting this week? Some of the major central banks.
Right. So big thing will be on Tuesday when we get Nigerians, the interest rate decision. And that is, of course, coming after we did see inflation in Nigeria quick in for an 18th straight month. It is north of 32%. And so the question will be whether or not we're going to see the central bank hike again. Of course, last month I did speak to the central bank governor who said his focus is on bringing inflation down. So the question will be, what is the messaging that we get from the governor? And then on Wednesday, we're waiting to see South Africa's, we're going to wait to see how South Africa's inflation is, the trajectory of inflation. Last week, we heard from the South African Reserve Bank governor. His focus is on bringing inflation down to the midpoint target in order to potentially get to rate cuts in the fall. And so whether or not we actually see that and really where we see inflation at will be very key to what we see sort of coming later on in the year from the MPC.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to keep a close eye on that. Jennifer, thank you so much for the latest what to watch out for this week in Africa. Jennifer Zabazaja, Bloomberg's Africa correspondent. Up next, Benjamin Netanyahu will address the U.S. Congress on Wednesday as unrest continues in the Middle East. We are live in Tel Aviv next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. Well, the Paris Olympics begin in 5 days, and the city has transformed itself. Apart from dozens of game sites across the city and throughout France, a new neighborhood is emerging around a stadium and aquatic center north of the capital. Bloomberg's Caroline Conan reports.
Tucked between highways and railways, the Port de la Chapelle neighborhood north of Paris has long been plagued by drugs and deprivation. But the Paris Olympics could be a game changer. The new arena stadium will host badminton and gymnastics and remain for basketball after the games.
We have decided to create both this arena and a new university campus where in 2025 we will have 8,000 students expected. It helps us to win 10 to 20 years to accelerate the transformation of the city.
A few steps away, the underprivileged suburb of Saint-Denis, already home to the Stade de France, has been chosen to build the aquatic center and the Olympic village. Most of the 15,000 athletes from around the world will sleep, eat and train here. After the Games, this futuristic place with low-carbon infrastructure shall become a new home for 6,000 residents and an office for another 6,000 employees. The legacy of Olympic infrastructures has not always been a success. The 2012 London Games did regenerate some deprived areas of East London. It's a different story for Athens, Beijing or Rio. The Games left those hosting cities with abandoned infrastructure and a big pile of debt. Paris promises this won't happen to the City of Light.
It was Caroline Conan reporting there, and of course, the Olympics kicks off in 5 days' time. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netayahu is heading to Washington today. The shifting of political winds could see a confident Netanyahu taking his message to a weakened Biden as Israeli forces continue attacking Gaza. And of course, we're keeping a close eye on the tit-for-tat that has been occurring between Israel and the Houthis over the course of this weekend. You will recall that as we went to the end of the show on Friday, it emerged that the Houthis had done their first deadly attack ever on Tel Aviv, and in response to that, we saw Israel actually respond over the course of the weekend, hitting a port in Yemen directly and blowing up a energy storage facility. So the tit-for-tat between the two is considerably intensifying. But here you can see, I just want to show you a picture of how the Israeli shekel is performing. This is the performance of the last 5 days. But actually, if you track the performance of the Israeli shekel over the course of July, what you will see is a big outperformance versus the UAD. It's about 3% stronger over the course of this month. And that tells you that as far as Israeli assets are concerned, if you look at the currency, if you look at local bond performance, and even if you look at stock market performance, just over the last couple of weeks, things have started to turn because at least from a foreign investor perspective, the expectations have moved a lot higher towards a successful passage of that potential ceasefire. So something to bear in mind as the Israeli Prime Minister heads to D.C. this week. He's still expected to be meeting with President Biden. We know the news from President Biden overnight. And also, even from Thursday last week, the White House said that Netanyahu is expected to be meeting with the VP Kamala Harris, who may as well be ending up to be the next Democratic candidate on the ticket come November. So he's still expected to meet with them. Unclear at this point whether he's going to meet with or have a phone call with former President Trump as well. But this is another terminal chart that we've been monitoring throughout the course of this morning. And of course, less than 10 hours ago, we found out that President Biden is no longer running for re-election. Look at what has happened to donations since that announcement came through. Over $50 million. In fact, it's now $65 million. If you look at the latest numbers, have been raised since he announced that he's dropping out of the presidential race. A lot of heavyweights have thrown their support behind Biden, the likes of Greg Newsom, also who was put as one of the other potential names for presidential candidate, throwing his weight behind Harris. We've also heard from the Clintons, the Black Caucus, and many others as well. So a story we will continue to monitor. But that's it for our show. That was Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.